The morning sun had barely broken over the city skyline, casting a soft, golden hue that filtered through the wide windows of the gallery. The gallery, nestled in the heart of the art district, was filled with gleaming white walls, polished floors, and an array of colorful paintings that seemed to whisper stories to anyone who stood still long enough to listen. The quiet elegance of the place gave it an air of exclusivity, a space that promised both prestige and profit for those deemed worthy. It was the type of gallery that catered to those who already had influence, a few pieces of history under their belts, and a clientele that appreciated art not just for its beauty but for its market value. Today, however, the gallery was more than just an exhibit of the finest art, it was the setting for an unexpected encounter. A young man, dressed in a well-worn, simple black jacket and faded jeans, walked into the gallery with a sense of nervous determination. His hands, which he kept clasped tightly together, carried a rolled-up canvas, carefully protected by a plastic sleeve. His name was Elijah Turner, a rising artist whose work had already begun to catch the eye of a few well-respected collectors in the underground art world. He had not yet found a formal gallery to showcase his pieces, and the opportunity to present his art to a seasoned dealer felt like a dream. Elijah stepped through the door, and the bells above it jingled lightly, announcing his arrival. The air inside was crisp, chilled by the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside. As he looked around, his eyes wandered over the various pieces lining the walls. Some were abstract, others hyper-realistic, all carefully curated to create an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. The gallery felt alive with its own history, a place where artists' dreams came to be realized, or crushed. Behind the front desk sat Marcus Bellamy, the owner of the gallery, a man who carried the polished look of someone who had seen it all. In his mid-50s, with neatly combed silver hair, sharp glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and a crisp white shirt that seemed to only accentuate his wealth, Marcus had an air of someone who had long ago made his mark in the art world. His reputation was built on knowing what sold and what didn't, and his connections with major collectors and high-end patrons were undeniable. Art was not just his passion, it was his business, and he treated it as such. When Elijah approached the counter, the gallery owner barely looked up from the small notebook in front of him, jotting down something, possibly a price or an important call to make. Elijah cleared his throat softly, and Marcus slowly raised his head, his sharp gaze sizing up the young man before him. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked with a voice that carried both curiosity and an underlying tone of dismissal, as though he had already judged Elijah before the young artist had even spoken a word. Elijah took a deep breath. "I have some work I'd like to show you. I'm an artist, and I was hoping to get your thoughts on my paintings." Marcus raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head as if to indicate he was only going to humor Elijah for a moment. "All right, let's see what you've got." Elijah unrolled the canvas, and the edges of the fabric rustled softly as he spread it out on the counter. The painting was striking, an abstract portrayal of a bustling cityscape, with bold strokes of color weaving through darkened shadows, creating an energy that felt both chaotic and harmonious. It was raw, passionate, and full of life, much like Elijah himself. Marcus looked at the piece for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of his desk. His expression remained unchanged. He murmured, a hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Interesting, I suppose. But let me guess, you're hoping to sell this at the next big auction, huh?" Elijah was taken aback by the tone, but he held his ground. "I think it could make a good addition to a collection. It speaks to the energy of the city, the people who live in it. It's unique." Marcus leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk as he appraised the canvas. "Unique? Sure. But unique doesn't always mean good, does it? Look, kid, I've been in this business long enough to know what sells. What I'm looking at here is a bit of a mess. I'm not sure the kind of people who buy art like this are the same people who frequent my gallery." Elijah's stomach sank, but he tried to remain composed. "It's not just about the buyers. It's about the message, the emotion behind the art. It's something people can connect with." Marcus chuckled under his breath, his finger swirling around the edge of his coffee cup. "Listen, kid. You've got a good heart, I can tell. But you're in the wrong place. This is a gallery for serious collectors, not some self-taught amateur trying to make a quick buck." The sting of those words hit Elijah harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to defend his work, but something in Marcus's condescending tone told him that no amount of explanation would change the man's mind. The gallery owner's dismissive attitude made it clear that he didn't see value in Elijah's art, or in Elijah himself. To Marcus, the art world was a business of labels, names, and trends. He couldn't be bothered with something he perceived as too raw, too unpolished. Marcus waved his hand dismissively, clearly uninterested in hearing more. "Look, I've got meetings to attend. I can't waste my time on this. Maybe try one of those trendy pop-up galleries or some local exhibitions, yeah? They're a little more forgiving. But here? You've got no chance." Elijah stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on him like a heavy weight. For a moment, he felt small, insignificant. His pride was wounded, and the idea of challenging Marcus seemed pointless. The gallery owner had already made up his mind, and no matter how much Elijah tried to explain the significance of his art, it would fall on deaf ears. He rolled up the canvas with careful hands, a quiet resolve settling over him. As he turned to leave, Marcus barely spared him another glance, already lost in his thoughts, his attention drifting elsewhere. As Elijah stepped out of the gallery and onto the quiet street, the sting of Marcus's mockery lingered. But rather than crush his spirit, it fueled a fire deep inside him. He knew the value of his work, even if Marcus didn't. And one day, he promised himself, Marcus would see it too. For now, Elijah kept walking, his steps steady and deliberate, a quiet determination building in his chest. The world may not have recognized his talent yet, but he was going to prove them wrong. In the years that followed his humbling encounter with Marcus Bellamy, Elijah Turner had come to embody two distinct realities: the artist the world had yet to know, and the man who had quietly built an empire behind the scenes. To the public, he remained a humble, aspiring painter, his name whispered only among a few underground art circles. But beneath that unassuming exterior, a hidden world was thriving, a world where his work was valued in ways Marcus Bellamy could never have imagined. Elijah's story was one of calculated patience. While the art world remained indifferent, even dismissive, of his early work, Elijah was laying the foundation for his future. He had known from the beginning that the right moment would come, when his art would be recognized for its true worth, not only for its emotional resonance but for its ability to speak to the pulse of a modern world desperate for depth and authenticity. He kept his identity a secret, deliberately distancing himself from the limelight and opting instead to remain an enigma. To many, this was the hallmark of true artistry, creating from a place so deep and private that the artist himself could slip into obscurity. Elijah's paintings were sold not under his name but through anonymous buyers who had caught wind of his work through private exhibitions. The demand for his pieces grew quickly, and as the years passed, so did their value. His once humble canvases, dismissed as chaotic and disjointed by Marcus, had become sought-after treasures in the highest echelons of the art world. The few privileged collectors who had discovered Elijah's talent, the ones who had witnessed his paintings in underground shows, had recognized something in his work that transcended trends. His art wasn't just about brushstrokes or colors, it was about stories, about a deeper connection to the human experience. His urban landscapes, his vivid abstractions, spoke of a world in turmoil and beauty, of contradictions that mirrored the complexities of the lives that inhabited them. They were filled with passion and movement, a reflection of the energy that pulsed beneath the surface of city streets. As the years went by, Elijah's paintings began to be sold in private auctions, where prices soared into the millions. His anonymity was part of the allure, adding a layer of mystery to the work itself. Art critics speculated about the unknown artist whose paintings seemed to capture the essence of everything they wanted to understand about contemporary life. The pieces were a fusion of abstraction and realism, a delicate dance between chaos and order, with each stroke revealing a story more profound than the last. But as his paintings became more valuable, Elijah kept to his vow of silence, letting his art speak for itself while he operated behind the scenes. He knew that the time would come when he would have to confront Marcus Bellamy, the gallery owner who had mocked him so harshly. In his mind, that moment would not be one of anger or vengeance, but of justice, a way to right the wrongs of that initial encounter. He would expose Marcus's ignorance not just for the satisfaction of proving a point, but to show the world that art, real art, couldn't be measured by price tags or pretentious gatekeepers. Elijah's plan was meticulous. He had been observing Marcus's gallery for years, watching as it slowly lost its grip on the art scene. The once thriving space, which had been a hub for high-end collectors and wealthy patrons, had begun to feel dated, its walls filled with pieces that lacked the depth and originality that Elijah's own work had come to represent. The once glamorous gallery had begun to stagnate, its owners desperate to find the next big thing but unable to attract the fresh talent they needed to keep the money flowing. As Marcus's financial troubles deepened, the artist saw an opportunity. His move would be strategic, a quiet coup. He would acquire the gallery, not as an angry artist seeking revenge, but as a powerful, calculating buyer who saw beyond the facade of Marcus's long-established reputation. The irony would be undeniable, and the poetic justice of it all made it even sweeter. Marcus, who had once scoffed at his work, would be left helpless in the face of the artist who had proven him wrong. In the meantime, Elijah continued to thrive in the shadows. His pieces were now in the hands of some of the most influential art collectors in the world, many of whom remained unaware of the artist's true identity. Some had taken to calling him the Invisible Artist, a name that suited him perfectly, adding to the mystique surrounding his work. The art world buzzed with speculation about his identity, each theory more outlandish than the last. Some claimed he was a reclusive genius, others speculated that he was a collective of artists working under one name. What they didn't know was that Elijah was working in plain sight, still living in the modest apartment he had rented when he first moved to the city. The walls of his home were filled with paintings, many of which would never see the light of day. They were a private expression of his thoughts and feelings, a quiet refuge from the noise of the world outside. But his public work, what he allowed to be seen, was the carefully crafted product of years of artistic evolution. Now, as the gallery's financial struggles deepened, and Marcus's attempts to revive his failing business became increasingly desperate, Elijah began to make his move. He reached out to a few well-connected contacts in the art investment world, people he had cultivated relationships with over the years. They weren't just interested in his work, they were intrigued by the idea of acquiring a gallery that had once been the crown jewel of the city's art scene. They knew it would be a profitable investment, but more than that, they saw the potential for something greater, a chance to reshape the art world, to put true artistry back in the hands of the artists who had been overlooked by the gatekeepers. With the paperwork in place, Elijah stood at the precipice of his greatest accomplishment yet. The time was coming. Soon, Marcus Bellamy would see for himself what it meant to underestimate someone like Elijah Turner. The art world would soon know his name, not as a mysterious figure hiding in the shadows, but as the man who had built a legacy from the ground up. His paintings, his vision, would now shape the future of art. And Marcus, the man who had once ridiculed him, would be left standing in the wake of his own ignorance. Elijah's secret was about to be exposed, and with it, the revelation that true art, and the true artist, could never be confined to the walls of a single gallery or the whims of a market-driven elite. As Elijah looked out of the window of his apartment, the city's skyline gleaming in the distance, he knew that his moment was near. It wasn't about revenge, it was about showing the world that the real power of art lay not in the opinions of men like Marcus Bellamy, but in the hands of those who dared to create it. And he was ready to reveal it all. Marcus Bellamy had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the delicate balance between art and commerce. For years, his gallery had been the talk of the art world, a space where wealthy patrons came to invest in the best and brightest of the art scene. The walls had once been adorned with vibrant pieces from celebrated contemporary artists, the kind of works that commanded six-figure prices at auction and were coveted by collectors eager to flaunt their acquisitions. But somewhere along the way, the tide began to shift. The art world, once a space defined by taste and tradition, had evolved, its tastes changing, its buyers seeking something different. And Marcus, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to adapt, began to see his empire crumble. The signs were subtle at first. There was a slight dip in attendance at opening nights. Fewer well-dressed patrons filled the gallery's pristine, gleaming halls during the exclusive VIP viewings. The lavish champagne receptions, which once served as the backdrop for high-profile transactions, grew quieter, more awkward. At first, Marcus had brushed it off as a temporary downturn, a minor blip in what had been a glittering career. But as the months wore on, it became clear that the art world was evolving in ways that he wasn't equipped to understand. He had tried to hold on to the old ways, curating traditional, well-established artists whose names were recognizable to the affluent crowd that frequented his gallery. But the world had changed. A new generation of collectors, younger, more diverse, and more connected to the digital age, had begun to demand something different. They were no longer interested in just the names, they wanted the stories, the authenticity, the rawness that came with work that had a deeper resonance. They were looking for something that spoke to the times, to their own experiences. They didn't want polished, perfect pieces, they wanted art that reflected the complexities and contradictions of the world they lived in. And then there was Elijah Turner. His name hadn't yet become a household word, but within certain circles, his work had already earned a reputation for its raw energy, its authenticity, and its ability to capture the essence of modern life. His pieces had become highly sought after in private, underground auctions, with collectors bidding astronomical amounts for works that were far outside Marcus's usual realm. Marcus, of course, had no idea who the artist was. He didn't even know that Elijah's paintings were circulating in the upper echelons of the art world. In his world, the names that mattered were those of established artists, those whose work was proven, whose value had already been defined. But Elijah's pieces had shaken the very foundation of Marcus's beliefs about what constituted good art. They were everything that Marcus wasn't used to: wild, untamed, brimming with emotion and passion, but also layered with intricate meaning. And with each new piece that found its way into the hands of collectors, the buzz around the unknown artist grew louder. Slowly, Elijah became the subject of heated discussions at auctions, in private galleries, and among critics who recognized that there was something more beneath the surface of his abstract forms and bold colors. The more the art world buzzed, the more Marcus's gallery floundered. The paintings that had once fetched millions at auction were now gathering dust on his walls, with few buyers willing to take the plunge. The old guard was aging, their taste outdated, and the younger, more daring collectors were flocking to new galleries that embraced unconventional voices and fresh perspectives. Marcus, who had long prided himself on being a tastemaker, was now nothing more than a relic of a bygone era. It wasn't long before the financial strain began to show. The bills piled up. The overhead costs, rent, staff salaries, insurance, and utilities, were eating into the gallery's dwindling profits. Marcus had always been adept at presenting a facade of success, throwing lavish galas and making high-profile announcements, but even the most meticulously crafted illusions can only hold up for so long. When the art sales began to dry up, the truth started to leak through the cracks. The once proud gallery, once a beacon of artistic success, now stood on the brink of ruin. The patrons who once eagerly signed checks for multi-million-dollar acquisitions were now looking elsewhere. The younger, more progressive collectors were flocking to new galleries, where the work felt fresh and exciting, where the art was untamed and real. Meanwhile, Marcus's gallery struggled to shift from the polished, commercialized art scene it had catered to for so long. He clung to old practices, unwilling to acknowledge that the world had moved on without him. The emails from suppliers and creditors grew more insistent. A lien was placed on the gallery's property. And the auction houses, once the partner of choice for Marcus's carefully curated sales, now refused to list his works, deeming them overpriced and unsellable. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Marcus had built this empire on the backs of artists who had been willing to sell themselves to the highest bidder. He had created a brand that he was proud of, that commanded respect. And now, he was watching it all slip through his fingers. But even in the darkest of times, Marcus had one final hope: the auction of his remaining assets, a desperate attempt to pull together enough capital to keep the gallery afloat. He had one last trick up his sleeve. He would auction off a collection of works that he believed had the potential to reignite the interest of wealthy patrons. But there was a problem. The works he had lined up for sale were already outdated, already seen as stale, by the very collectors who once clamored for them. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the art world, Elijah Turner had been watching it all unfold. He knew that the time was right. His art had already reached the heights of success, with pieces fetching millions in private auctions. But what Marcus Bellamy and the rest of the art world didn't know was that Elijah was no longer just the artist. They were about to meet the buyer who would change everything. Elijah had acquired the resources and the influence to make his move. He had watched as Marcus continued to struggle, unwilling to let go of his antiquated ideas about what art should be. He had watched as the gallery's downfall seemed inevitable. And now, he knew the perfect way to make his mark, not just as the artist who had been mocked, but as the person who would take control of the very gallery that had once dismissed him. Elijah reached out to his network of investors, people who recognized not only the monetary value of his work, but also the power dynamics at play in the art world. It wasn't just about acquiring a property. It was about taking back the power, about reshaping the narrative in the way that he had always intended. In a quiet, discreet transaction, Elijah became the new owner of Marcus Bellamy's once proud gallery. He had purchased it for a fraction of its value, a move that shocked everyone involved. No one knew it was coming. Marcus, too proud to admit his defeat, was blindsided by the sudden shift in power. His gallery, now in the hands of the artist he had once dismissed, was no longer his own. Elijah didn't want to just take over, he wanted to transform the gallery into something that aligned with his vision of art, a space where creativity could flow freely, unburdened by the constraints of commercialization. He wanted to create a space that valued authenticity over profit, where the work spoke for itself. It wasn't about getting back at Marcus. It was about creating a legacy, one where the voices of unheard artists could finally be recognized. As Elijah sat in the office of his new gallery, looking out over the space he now owned, he couldn't help but smile. The gallery that had once dismissed him, that had underestimated his talent and his potential, was now his. And with it came the chance to redefine what art could be, to rewrite the rules of a world that had long been dominated by wealth, status, and gatekeepers. The fall of Marcus Bellamy was just the beginning. The dim light of the afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the gallery, casting long, dramatic shadows across the cold, polished floors. The space was quiet now, almost too quiet, as though the very air around it had been stilled by the weight of what was happening. The gallery, once a thriving epicenter of high-profile art, the place where the city's elite mingled and traded in fortunes, was now a shell of its former self. The vast halls that once echoed with laughter and the clink of champagne glasses now stood in a silence that seemed deafening. Marcus Bellamy, the once proud owner of the gallery, sat behind the sleek, modern desk in his office, his fingers tapping nervously on the polished wood. The papers in front of him were a blur, nothing seemed to make sense anymore. The auction had failed. The funds from the auction house hadn't covered even half of the debts. The creditors were relentless, and the weight of their demands pressed down on him with a suffocating force. His empire was falling apart. But in all the chaos, there was one thing he hadn't expected, one thing that was so surreal, so unbelievable, that it seemed impossible to even fathom. He had been blindsided, caught off guard, as the gallery that had been his legacy was quietly purchased out from under him. The news had come in through a cryptic call, and Marcus had been told that the deal had been finalized. His beloved gallery, his vision, his life's work, was now under new ownership. He hadn't known who had purchased it. At first, he had thought it might be another wealthy collector, someone with deep pockets and an eye for old-school art. But when the door to his office opened, he wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. The tall figure who stepped into the room was familiar, though Marcus couldn't place the face at first. He had a calm, steady gait, moving with purpose, but without hurry, his every step deliberate. He wore a tailored suit, modern and sleek, his posture straight and confident. His presence in the room was commanding, yet there was something unassuming about him, almost as if he didn't need to announce his authority to anyone. He simply exuded it. It took Marcus a moment to recognize the man. The face, the presence, the demeanor, it all clicked when the man finally spoke. Elijah Turner. For a brief moment, Marcus's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach twisted in an uncomfortable knot. He stood up, startled, his eyes widening in disbelief. He tried to smile, but it felt forced, strained. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Elijah Turner? The artist? The young man whose work he had mocked so many years ago? What are you doing here? Marcus asked, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his composure. Elijah stood still, his eyes calm and unwavering. He glanced around the office, taking in the opulence that once represented Marcus's success. It was a stark contrast to the reality of the moment, the gallery's decline, the mounting debt, the desperate measures Marcus had been forced to take. The gallery's once gleaming walls were now dull, the art on display more stale than groundbreaking. The air felt thick with the weight of all that had been lost. "I'm here for a few reasons, Marcus," Elijah said softly, his tone even, as if discussing something entirely unrelated. "I thought it was time you and I had a conversation." Marcus furrowed his brow, his mind still struggling to keep pace. "A conversation? About what?" Elijah took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. "About how everything has come full circle. About how the tables have turned." It was then that Marcus felt a cold rush of realization. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind finally grasped the enormity of the situation. He had always been the one with control, the one who dictated who was worthy, who had value. He had laughed at Elijah's work, dismissed him as another unknown artist, a dreamer with no place in the competitive art world. He had been so sure that his place at the top was unshakable. But now, as the silence hung heavy in the room, Marcus understood. The artist standing before him wasn't just any artist. He was the artist, the one whose work had long since surpassed the value of anything Marcus had ever touched. Elijah's paintings were now worth millions, his name whispered with reverence in galleries around the world. And now, the artist had returned, not as a supplicant, not as someone seeking validation, but as the owner of the very place that had once mocked him. "You." Marcus's voice cracked, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. "You own the gallery?" Elijah nodded slowly, his expression calm but unwavering. "Yes. I do." The words hung in the air, heavy with irony and the weight of truth. Marcus's mind reeled, struggling to accept the reality in front of him. His pride, his reputation, everything he had built, now belonged to the artist he had belittled. How did you?" Marcus stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. "I don't understand. How could this happen? How could you have afforded to?" Elijah interrupted, his voice cutting through the haze of confusion. "I've been doing quite well, Marcus. My art has found a market. It's been valued by people who actually understand its worth." He let the words sink in, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "While you were busy dismissing me, others were seeing what you refused to. You may have dismissed me once, but the world didn't." Marcus's chest tightened. He had been too caught up in his own world, too focused on maintaining his dominance, to notice that things were shifting. The young, unknown artist who had walked into his gallery years ago had turned out to be the very person who would own the future of the art world. Elijah paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "You mocked me, Marcus," he continued softly, his tone more matter-of-fact than angry. "You belittled my work, my vision, my worth. You assumed that just because I wasn't part of your circle, I didn't belong. And now, here I am, standing in the very place you tried to control." Marcus's face flushed with a mix of shock, embarrassment, and humiliation. He had never expected this. He had thought he was in charge, that he could dictate who mattered and who didn't. But now, the balance had shifted. The power had been taken from him, not with a loud declaration or an angry confrontation, but with quiet precision, with the slow realization that the world he had built had outgrown him. why are you doing this? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why come here to confront me? What do you want? Elijah took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. I don't want anything from you, Marcus. I don't need your validation or your approval. I just wanted you to see the truth. This gallery is mine now. And I'm going to make sure that it stands for something different than what it was before. This is where new voices will be heard. Where true art will be celebrated, not based on who you know or how much money you can spend, but on the merit of the work itself. The room felt colder, the silence heavier as Elijah's words settled over Marcus like a thick fog. The realization that he had been outpaced, outsmarted, and ultimately surpassed by the very person he had written off was too much to bear. And yet, there was something almost peaceful in Elijah's demeanor, no anger, no revenge, just a quiet, undeniable certainty that the world was shifting in ways Marcus could no longer control. Elijah took one final, deliberate step toward Marcus's desk. I'll be taking over now. It's time for you to leave. Marcus sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and surrender. His empire had crumbled, not through a series of dramatic confrontations or fiery battles, but through the quiet, resolute rise of the artist he had dismissed. And as he looked at Elijah one last time, he couldn't help but realize that the world had changed in ways he could never have imagined. Elijah turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing in the silent room as he walked toward the door. The gallery was now his, its past, its present, and its future. And for the first time in years, Marcus Bellamy understood that true power in the art world wasn't determined by who owned the most expensive paintings or the grandest gallery. It was determined by who had the vision to see the world for what it truly was, and the courage to make it their own. The rain had started to fall softly, its steady rhythm tapping against the windows of the gallery. It was the kind of evening that seemed to mirror Marcus Bellamy's thoughts, heavy, relentless, and without mercy. Outside, the city bustled, alive with the energy of an ever-changing world, but inside the walls of the gallery, everything had changed. The world Marcus once knew had slipped away, leaving only the bitter sting of his arrogance and the suffocating silence of his defeat. Marcus had spent the last few days in a haze, trying to make sense of everything. He had once been at the center of the art world, invited to the most exclusive parties, courted by the wealthiest collectors, his gallery a symbol of power and prestige. But now, he was a shadow of that man, a man who had clung to the idea that power in the art world was determined by influence, wealth, and connections. That same man had mocked Elijah Turner, the young artist who had walked into his gallery years ago with nothing but hope and a vision. Marcus had been wrong. He had underestimated the very essence of art, the idea that true value is not defined by money, not by the recognition of the elite, but by the authenticity of the work and the spirit of the artist who creates it. In his pursuit of the commercial side of art, Marcus had missed the truth that Elijah had understood all along. Art was not just about the financial transaction. It was about the stories it told, the emotions it evoked, and the ways it could change the world. Now, the gallery was no longer his. It was Elijah's. Marcus could do nothing but watch as the new owner set his vision into motion. The process of transformation had already begun. The walls that had once been adorned with the stale, predictable works of old masters were now being filled with bold new pieces. The gallery, which had once been a fortress of exclusivity, was becoming a sanctuary of creativity, a space for voices that had long been overlooked, underappreciated, and silenced by the very structures that Marcus had upheld. It was in the quiet of that transition that Marcus began to realize the full scope of his downfall. It wasn't just the loss of a business or the collapse of his reputation, it was the loss of something far more profound. He had lost his connection to what made art truly powerful. He had become a gatekeeper instead of a champion. He had been too focused on keeping others out that he failed to recognize the changing currents of the world around him. And now, he was paying the price for his stubbornness and pride. But it wasn't just his own pride that had led to his downfall. It was the way he had built his success on the backs of others, exploiting their talents without ever truly valuing them. Marcus had seen artists as commodities, objects to be bought and sold, rather than as human beings with voices, visions, and stories that deserved to be heard. In his rush to climb to the top, he had overlooked the one thing that could have sustained him, a genuine love and respect for the art itself. As he sat in his now empty office, the sound of the rain against the window growing louder, Marcus thought about his mistakes. He had been quick to dismiss Elijah, but he had been just as quick to dismiss the very foundation of what had made art great. He thought back to that day, years ago, when Elijah had walked into his gallery with a portfolio in hand, hopeful, but uncertain. He had been so eager to dismiss him, to tell him he wasn't ready, that his work wasn't good enough. And in doing so, Marcus had robbed himself of the opportunity to see something beautiful, something transformative, something that would change the course of his own life. Marcus stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he walked over to the window. The city was alive with lights and movement, a testament to the forces of change that had swept through it. The art world had moved on, but it wasn't the end of art, it was the beginning of something new. A new generation of artists, of voices, was rising up. And in that new world, Marcus Bellamy had no place. It was a bitter lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And yet, as he stood there, staring out into the rain, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The burden of arrogance and pride that had weighed so heavily on him was gone. It had been replaced by the stark realization that art could not be controlled. It couldn't be owned by the powerful, the wealthy, or the influential. Art, true art, belonged to everyone. The artist's rebirth. Meanwhile, across town, in the quiet and rejuvenated halls of the gallery, Elijah Turner had begun the work of rebuilding, not just the walls and the exhibits, but the very spirit of the place. He stood in the center of the main gallery space, his hands in his pockets, watching as his team worked around him. The walls, once sterile and imposing, were now alive with color and form, as new works began to take shape on the canvas. The space was filled with energy, a pulse that matched the heart of the city itself. He had been given the chance to reshape the gallery into something far greater than what it had been, something more meaningful, more authentic, more real. Elijah reflected on his own journey. He had faced rejection, doubt, and ridicule, but through it all, he had never lost sight of his vision. There had been moments when he questioned himself, when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear. But each time, he had returned to the canvas, to the work itself, finding solace and purpose in the act of creation. He had learned the importance of perseverance, the power of sticking to your beliefs, even when the world tells you that you're not enough. He had also learned humility. He had never sought revenge on Marcus or anyone else who had doubted him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His success was his own, and it was built on the strength of his art, not the need for validation. Now, standing in the gallery that he had once been mocked in, Elijah was ready to open the doors to a new era. His vision for the space was one of inclusivity, diversity, and raw authenticity. It would no longer be a place for the privileged few who could afford to purchase art for the sake of status or power. It would be a space where artists of all backgrounds, those who had long been pushed to the margins, could find a voice. It would be a space where the stories of the unheard could be told, where the future of art could be shaped. He had already started reaching out to artists from underrepresented communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. He invited them to share their stories, to let their work speak for them in ways that the world had denied them before. The gallery would no longer cater to the tastes of the few, it would celebrate the many. As the day of the grand reopening approached, Elijah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had won, not in the way that Marcus had hoped to, not through money or power, but by doing what he believed in, by sticking to his vision, by showing the world that art was not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a means of self-expression, a tool for social change, and a reflection of humanity. The evening of the grand reopening arrived, and the gallery buzzed with excitement. The doors were thrown open, and guests poured in, curators, collectors, artists, critics, and art lovers from all walks of life. The walls were adorned with vibrant, thought-provoking works that spoke to the struggles, joys, and complexities of the human experience. The crowd was diverse, lively, and eager to engage with the art on display. There was an energy in the air that felt fresh and alive. As Elijah stood near the entrance, greeting guests and watching them interact with the art, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what it was all about. This was the future of art. It wasn't about power, it wasn't about who you knew or how much money you had. It was about the stories you told, the connections you made, and the way art could bring people together in a shared understanding of the world around them. In the distance, he saw Marcus Bellamy enter the gallery. The former gallery owner stood on the outskirts, watching, his face a mask of contemplation. Elijah didn't go to him, didn't seek out his attention. Instead, he allowed Marcus to see, on his own terms, the fruits of his own arrogance and mistakes. The gallery was now a testament to the future, to the voices that had been overlooked for far too long. It was a place where artists could thrive, where their voices could finally be heard. As the evening wore on, the gallery filled with conversation, with laughter, with the hum of excitement that only a place of true creativity could inspire. Elijah Turner had won, not through confrontation or retribution, but through the power of vision, humility, and perseverance. And the art world, forever changed, was better for it.